I got time for us to get started. As far as any changes on the sick list, I've got Margaret and Sophie are at home. And on the bulletin board, there's announcements of different events, different congregations in the area. And tonight is the deadline for collecting for autism. And remember, Saturday at the Auto Clean Car Wash, that's down by KFC, between the old Pizza Hut and the, I guess the Mexican restaurant, I guess is still there. Between those two at that car wash, fundraiser for Sophie, and it's to go towards medical expenses and transportation expenses. So everybody has their assignment tonight, and that's all the announcements I have. And I think JC's got the scripture.
Leviticus chapter 19, verses 15 through 18. I'll be reading from a New King James. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty in righteousness. You shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go about as a talebearer among your people, nor shall you take a stand against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord.
What number you got, Don? 61. That'll be our song of invitation. We're going to mark 61. Tonight, for devotional thought, I want to go sort of we went for to a few weeks ago in Leviticus 19. You remember we studied this a few weeks ago, and we've had singing night and some other things, and I feel like it's been a while since we've been here. But you remember we've been studying Leviticus 19, and we know it for that very familiar verse. The last verse Brother J.C. read for us, there to love your neighbor as yourself. And that is the linchpin. And we talk about this idea because of how important it is in Scripture. Because it is the commandment that Jesus himself said is the second commandment. Remember, he said the first, the greatest, is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then he said the second is like unto it, and that is to love your neighbor and to care for your neighbor. And that's sort of the gist of what we're going to look at tonight in Leviticus 19, is it's all about caring for your neighbor and talking about who your neighbor is. And again, we see that throughout the Bible, that question of who is the neighbor. And when we see that, this commandment is what leads into in Luke, where Jesus gives that parable of the Good Samaritan, because that whole devotion, that whole lesson, that parable was based on the question, who is my neighbor? And then you remember he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, the man that didn't have a part of the law, that wasn't a Jew. He wasn't a part of God's chosen people, but yet he was the one who stopped and helped the man. And then you remember the one, even the lawyer who's questioned him, his answer was that the neighbor was the one who stopped and helped him. He didn't even want to say the Samaritan was. And again, the interesting thing about that story is before that story starts, the lawyer asked Jesus a question about the law. And Jesus says, what is your reading of the law? And the man quotes the two commandments I just quoted to you. And so what we see here is the importance of this command to love your neighbor as yourself. And I thought it was very interesting and interesting in how everything sort of works together and how things are happening with us, because in our book that we've been studying, our lessons on Sunday morning have all been about one another, about loving each other, encouraging one another, edifying each other. And you had to bear with me, I can't remember which lesson we're on because I'm trying to get weeks ahead. And so I know we're about to, either we just studied edify or we're about to study edify. And As we look at that idea of the church, we see that we're to be that community. And like we said Sunday morning, our life as a church is not to be self-centered, but other-centered. And that's the gist of this command, is to love your neighbor as yourself. It's easy to love ourselves, take care of ourselves, do what's best for us. But it's not so easy every time to look after our neighbor, to care for our neighbor. And the verses before this JC read, God speaks to that effect, where he says you look after the people who can't take care of themselves. You look after those around you. Don't slander them. Don't give preference in judgment. Don't hate your brother. But instead he says, love him. It's very interesting to me that from beginning to end, God's law has that same message, that we are to love one another. And just as we said Sunday morning and the last few Sunday mornings, that commandment ties into being like God. Because the entire purpose, the entire reason of Jesus coming was because he loved us. He loved us enough to send his son to die for us. Again, God didn't gain anything by sending his son. Jesus didn't gain more power, more glory, more whatever because he came to this earth. The only thing that was gained was by us, where we have that avenue of salvation. We have that avenue to come to God. And God calls us to love each other as he has loved us. This morning, I want to ask you, this evening, I want to ask you, are you loving those around you? Do we love our neighbor? The one that's sitting in the pew next to us, the one sitting across from us, the one we meet on the road. Are we being the people of love that God has called us to be? Because remember, Jesus will say in John, I forget exactly where it is now, John 15-19, when he's doing his last night, he says the world will know his disciples by the love that they show, the love they have. Are we being those loving people? If we're not, we need to change our lives so that we are. Because most likely, if we're not being that loving person, we are not other-centered, we're self-centered. And that's not what a Christian's called to be. Tonight, if you're not being the other-centered, other-focused, loving person you ought to be, we encourage you to change your life so that you are. If you're not a Christian, you've not experienced that love and care that God has given you, we encourage you to come and let that be known and take those steps to make that right, to see the love of God. That salvation he's given through his son that comes to us by that act of baptism. Or if you're a Christian who's lived for God for a while, you've been other focused, but you sort of let the world sneak back in and pull you back into its way of thinking, come back to God. Repent of that selfish thought. Repent of that self-centeredness. And turn back to God. And let him help you love each other once again. This evening, if we're not being the loving people and loving each other as God has called us to do, let us change our lives, change our minds, and be the people God has called us to be. Tonight, if you're not obeying the second greatest command, to love your neighbor as yourself, we encourage you to change your life and start. And we ask this evening that if you need anything, you'll come as we stand and as we sing.
The voice of the Savior says, come. The cross where he died is in sight. Now at the cross there is room. Are you coming to Jesus tonight? Are you coming to Jesus tonight? Are you coming to Jesus tonight? The bride and the Spirit invite. Are you coming to Jesus tonight? Oh, who to himself will be true, of all whom these voices invite, who answers, my brother, do you? Are you coming to Jesus tonight? Are you coming to Jesus tonight? Are you coming to Jesus tonight? The bride and the Spirit invite. Are you coming to Jesus tonight?
Let us pray.
Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this day and its many blessings. We're so thankful for the opportunity we have to come and study from thy word tonight. Our Father, we'd ask you to be with the sick, ones that we have mentioned, is be with Randy Holly, Mary Frances Clifton, Nellie Coker, Sophie Grove, Doris Delaney, Freddie Brown, Jim Clark, Dixie Murphy, Ricky Howell, and Linda Butler. Father, just comfort them in whatever way that they need. Father, we ask you to be with those who have lost loved ones, comfort them as only you can. Father, we're so thankful for the leaders of the church. Ask you to be with Doug and Mackie as they lead this congregation and guide them in their decisions, and be with our deacons. Father, be with all the missionaries that go in the foreign fields, and may many souls be won for Christ. Father, we're about to separate to our classes. Be with our teachers and be with each one of us that we listen attentive, and may good things come from tonight's study. Father, forgive us when we fail thee. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
All right, if you got your Bibles, and hope you already got there, we will be studying from Leviticus 19 tonight. Leviticus 19, we sort of got through about verse 18, I think, last time we were here, but we sort of had to rush these last few verses, so I want to back up just a little bit and pick these back up and continue to study these as we look at this great chapter. And again, I don't want to rush this middle section because these verses we're looking at, verse 15 to 18, JC read, is sort of the focal point of this entire chapter. This entire chapter has been about loving your neighbor as yourself and what that love will do. And really, it's the rest of this chapter that will focus on the same thought. The same idea, the same process that we ought to do. And so we begin in verse 15, and again, we talked about this before. It's very interesting to me how God lays this out. When he says, you shall do no unrighteousness or injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. But in righteousness you shall you judge your neighbor. It's very interesting there that he lays this out about judging. And again, we talked about this a few weeks ago, but I'll remind you that in the ancient world, in Israel, that any man of an older standing, or not just necessarily what we call older men, but a man who was in age would sometimes be called to judge a case. They didn't have judges whose whole job, like we'd have, was to judge court cases. They would have city gates where if you had an issue with your neighbor, you would bring it to the city gates. And they would choose one of the men or a couple of the men from the community, and they would judge the case, and they would decide what was to be done. And so God here is speaking. When he talks about this, we may look here and say, well, this doesn't really apply to everybody. It just applies to these judges. Well, these judges were everybody. Anybody in the city could be called to be a judge. So he says when you judge, when you're called to sit down and decide a case, he says do no injustice. Don't show favoritism one way or the other. And this is what's always been interesting to me, and I think I've made this statement a few times, and I'll probably keep making it, is it's very interesting to me that he starts with don't defer to the poor. Don't look at the poor man and side with him just because he's poor. But then also don't side with the rich man just because he's rich. He said instead, he says, you shall do your judgment, and that's the rest of the verse, do your judgment in righteousness. Make the righteous judgment, the judgment that is right according to the word of God. And he said, in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor. You're to look at every court case, look at every case as it stands, as it rightly is. And it's sort of a reminder to us that we too need to not look at things in certain ways and look to people, defer to certain people, defer not to other people, but to judge everyone in righteousness. And again, we may not be in those positions, but we still have this position where we have to determine how to act. And then, as he goes to verse 16, to continue this theme about your neighbor, you'll notice he repeats the word neighbor again. In verse 15, he says you judge your neighbor. And in verse 16, don't go around and slander people. The idea of slander is to go about and King James says to be a talebearer is basically you tell stories about someone, whether they're true or false. And the idea is those stories you tell are stories that people like to hear because they've got some kind of juicy bit to them. We would call them probably gossip. And it's tearing that person's reputation down. He says, you shall not do that. He said, instead, you shall look after your neighbor. And that's sort of where the rest of this verse goes, where he says, you shall not stand up against the life of your neighbor. And that idea is if your neighbor's life is in peril, then you have a responsibility to do something. If you see someone hurting, you see someone in a spot where they're about to be injured, you need to step up, especially if it's something that's life-threatening. You need to step up and take care of them. Well, why? Because you love them. And this is where we're all headed to. This is all headed toward that main verse in verse 18. Then you notice verse 17, he says, you shall not hate your brother in your heart, but shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. This is an interesting verse here that sort of defeats what a lot of people want to say about the Old Testament, and it's something that we sometimes get in our head. And that is that we like to look at the Old Testament and think that the Old Testament was supposed to be done like the Pharisees did it. We look at the Pharisees, and they're one of the major ones we see, and we think that's Jewish history, our Jewish lifestyle. It's not. And I say that because we want to look at actions. We want to say the Old Testament is just about actions, obeying the law, being obedient to the law, doing what the law says. That's number one. But you look here. It's not an action that God forbids. It's an emotion. Do not hate your brother. That starts before you do an action against your brother. He says, do not hate your brother. Do not hate your brother in your heart. And the idea is you hate your brother because he's done something against you. What do? Well, this sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Sounds to me very familiar what Jesus says to do when a brother sins against you. Listen when he goes on to say, don't hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason with him frankly. You shall rebuke him wisely, I think the King James says. What God's saying is if your neighbor does you wrong, don't hate that neighbor, don't despise that neighbor. Instead, you go talk to him. Go discuss how to fix that problem. And do not incur sin. And he says, do not let that hate start. And that hate sort of leads into verse 18, where he says, you shall not take vengeance nor bear a grudge. And again, this verse here, again, before we get to the second greatest command, this sort of tears apart what we sometimes, again, think about the Old Testament. Because we think about the Old Testament, and a lot of people think about the Old Testament, that think about this. We like to look at an eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and say, well, that means that's personal vengeance. That if you knock out my eye, I get to knock your eye out. That's not what God intended. How do we know that? Well, listen to this verse. Don't bear a grudge, and don't take vengeance. Don't take personal vengeance. Let the court system take the vengeance. You see, that eye for eye is not that Don does something to me and damages my eye, so I go after Don. It's that Don does something to my eye, I go to the court. We present our case, and the court says, hey, look, Don, this is the damage you did. Here's your punishment. It's not in my hands, it's in the court's hands. And God says, do not let that command be a personal. And he goes on even further with that, and it's very interesting. He starts with that idea, and that's what leads into, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And again, this is a foundational point of Christianity and also the Old Testament. That idea that we ought to love each other and care for each other. This is that idea. This command is something, I think I may mention it before. It's very interesting to me that I read someone who put this together. I did not put this together myself. Is that when you look at this command, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, it sounds very similar to what we call the golden rule, doesn't it? You know, the golden rule, we do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. It's very similar to love your neighbor as yourself. You love your neighbor like you ought to do. And what happens here is one writer summed it up this way, and I thought it's a pretty good summation. He said this statement is given if there is a problem, something happens between two people that God has not covered, and he covers a good bit, but if there's a law that God, or if there's a circumstance that God has not covered, and you have to say, okay, how do we handle this situation? The easy way to say it is, okay, how can I handle this and love my neighbor as myself? Not about me, it's about the community, about the rest of us, and that's the idea here. And God says this is what you're going to do, because you notice how he ends this. And again, we talked about this before. In this chapter, he repeats this phrase a lot. I am the Lord. I am Yahweh. And that is God's covenant name with Israel. This is God giving his stamp, saying this is how you've got to be. And so from there, we go into the next part of this chapter. And the rest of this chapter is, again, connected with this idea of loving your neighbor as yourself and how you're to respond to that and what that does. And it does two things. In the rest of this chapter, this is connected to loving your neighbor as yourself. It does two things. One, it talks about how to respect your neighbor. But two, it talks about how to be the people that God has called you to be holy. To love your neighbor as yourself is be against what this world says to do. Because we think our world today is this way. This world's been this way forever. This world's always been dog eat dog. What we call that it's all about me. And the worldly mind says, whatever I can do to get ahead, no matter how many people I have to step on, claw over, bury in the ground, I'll do whatever it takes to get to the top. That's what the world says. God says, no, that's not the way it ought to be. That's a wrong way of living. And so these rest of these commandments are fitting in those two categories. So let's look at these commandments. So that's verse 19. You shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your cattle breed with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed, nor shall you wear a garment of cloth made of two kinds of material. I heard it sort of tickles me, because this is one of the verses I've read people try to say, well, Christians just don't follow the Bible. Because they said if Christians followed the Bible, then they couldn't go shopping at Walmart. Because guess what? Majority of the clothes we wear, they're blended material. They're not all one material. And they'll say, oh, well, you don't follow the Bible if you have a garment that's multiple material. And then you have to go and say, well, you're digging in the Old Testament. But you have to ask the question, why? Why did God give this command? Why did God say don't breed two different kinds of animals, two different kinds of cattle? Why did God say don't sow two different kinds of seed? Why did God say don't mix two kinds of garments together? There's a practical reason and a spiritual reason. And then there's the ultimate reason. I'll give you that one too. The practical reason is that as far as the seed and the garment go, there's practical reason for not mixing them. One is the practical for the seed. If you plant two seed together in the same row, those seeds, no matter what they are, no matter how closely related to each other, they're gonna come to fruit. They're gonna be at maturity at different times. And if they're sown together, you can't get one without destroying the other. So that's practically not going to happen. A garment that is made of two different materials, as you wash it, as you wear it, those different materials are going to shrink at a different rate. And those two materials are going to rip. And again, this is historical. Now, the practical, that's the practical application of this. The spiritual application is God is trying to tell his people, you be separate. Because remember, God has stressed over and over again, you be separate. Don't be like the Gentiles. Don't intermix with the Gentiles. And I think this is a special, a spiritual application of this. In the physical world, don't blend these two together. Just as the physical is not to be blended with the cattle, the seed, or the garments, so my people are not supposed to blend with the world. They're not supposed to be gathered together because they're not going to fit together. And then the ultimate reason of why this is going to be is because God's going to say, I said so. Keep my statutes. I am the Lord your God. You're going to have to keep those. So he lays out this command of keeping these different things, not mixing these different things together. We go from there to verse 20. If a man lies sexually with a woman who is a slave assigned to another man and not yet ransomed or given her freedom, a distinction shall be made. They shall not be put to death because she was not free. But he shall bring his compensation to the Lord for the entrance of the tent of meeting, a ram for a guilt offering. And the priest shall make atonement for him with the ram of the guilt offering before the Lord, for this is for his sin that he has committed, and he shall be forgiven for the sin that he has committed. So we get a situation here where a man lies with a woman, and this woman is a slave. Now, this is not his slave. This is a slave of another man. And the implication here, and we're never really spelled out exactly what the idea is here, but it almost sounds to me as maybe this is a forced situation. Again, when you've got a master and slave, as we've seen in history, they can be a very easily abused relationship. That seems to be the case here, and the reason I say that is because you look at most of what happens to make this right falls at the feet of the man. The man is in the fault here, not necessarily the woman, and that leads me to think that maybe, and again, this is my interpretation, I think the woman may have been one that's forced in this situation. Now, it does not say that she's completely innocent in every case, but there is some idea of guilt implied here. But yet, we see this happens with the one who's not yet been ransomed or given her freedom, meaning she's not free. She's not. She still belongs to another man. And if this happens, you notice the end of this verse, she shall not be put to death. Well, why did God have to say that? Because what happened if you committed adultery? You're supposed to be stoned. And God lays out that this is not necessarily that kind of adultery. And again, I'm not going to get into deep discussion about that, but the consequences is different. If it's adultery, then it's death on the spot. This is a different situation. Again, this leads me to think this is the more idea that the woman, the slave, is forced into this relationship rather than her choice. And again, notice they shall not be put to death because she was not free. And so it hinges on her. Well, what does he do? It doesn't mean that just because he's done this with a slave woman that he doesn't get stoned so he's free. There are consequences. And what those consequences are, we don't know, but we do know what he's got to do to make it right. Notice, he still has to come and bring compensation to the Lord. He's going to bring the ram of a guilt offering. And he shall come to the priest, and the priest shall offer the atonement for him. He'll make this guilt offering for the sin he's committed, and then he shall be forgiven. And again, it's very interesting to me that all this lays at the man more than the woman. And to me, that seems to point to the idea that the man is more at fault than the woman here. And again, I think that this being a man and a slave woman gives that a little more idea than a regular relationship would. But that's verse 22. Any question about any of those so far? In that situation, well, if you look back at that situation, is that Abraham took her as sort of a second wife. He took her as she wasn't the same as Sarah, but he took her there. It wasn't, again, to me, this seems more like a forced situation where Hagar wasn't a forced situation, that it was a choice that they made. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like I say, Sarah's the one that seems to be the one that had the idea for him to do that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah. They wasn't to this point yet. All right, let's go to the next one. Verse 23. We're going to talk about planting. Verse 23, when you come into the land and plant any kind of tree for food, then you shall regard its fruit as forbidden. 3 years it shall be forbidden to you. It must not be eaten. And in the 4th year all of its fruit shall be holy, an offering of praise to the Lord. But in the 5th year you may eat of its fruit to increase its yield for you. I am the Lord your God. So God lays out this standard. He says, when you go into the land and you plant a tree, you plant an orchard, you are to let that orchard grow for 3 years. And this is not unique to the Bible. There is Babylonian documents from contemporary times with the Bible. And one of those documents talk about that one of the common practices of growing an orchard was if you planted an orchard, you had to wait 3 years. The first 3 years, the orchard produced very little, if any, fruit, and the fruit it did produce was not good. And then in the 4th year, it would start producing good fruit. Now, the difference is that here, God says you plant these trees, you got to wait 3 years. The 4th year, the fruit is good, but all that fruit is God's. And then the 5th year, you can start partaking of it. And some people will look at that and say, well, that's sort of unfair of God, isn't it? That what are they supposed to do for the first 5 years? Well, there's a few things we've got to realize. Number one, this was for a new orchard, not an existing one. You remember God has promised Israel over and over again, when you go into Canaan, I'm going to give you land ready to go. He gave them houses, gardens, orchards that were growing. They didn't have to worry about this command, and I don't want to say that badly. They didn't have to worry about this command when they went into Canaan. This was after they're in Canaan and they plant a new orchard. The other flip side about this is this took faith. Can you imagine that for a minute? Think about this. I was thinking about this today. Can you imagine the ones of us who like to plant a garden, or you've liked to plant for, that if you wanted to go plant a garden or plant some trees for some fruit, that you could wait 5 years before you ate anything that came off that tree? That takes faith. That takes faith and trust in God that says, I'm going to wait. Especially, and again, it blows my mind, especially with our world, because we want it now. We want to plant a tree this year, next year we're ready for the fruit off of it. And that's not how it works. But they waited. And this waiting was their truth, their trust, their faith in God. And then you notice that God gives them a promise here. But you notice there's also a promise here. Look at verse 5. He says, in the 5th year you can eat that fruit. And if you do that, he says, to increase its yield for you. I am the Lord your God. God says, if you'll wait the time that I've told you to wait and do my command, guess what? That orchard is going to be prosperous. That orchard is going to produce. Now, I'm not saying it's going to have bumper crop every year, but God's saying it's going to increase. It's going to be a healthy orchard because you're going to be blessed because you obey me. And again, we sometimes don't like that because that sounds like God paying us to obey, but that's God's promise. You obey me, here's your reward for it. And that's sort of what we're going to see. And again, you notice God ends this with again saying, I am the Lord your God. You do this because I said so. And again, that's an answer we sometimes don't like to hear. As parents, we sometimes turn to give that answer, but we don't like to hear that answer. But God says, this is what you're going to do. To be my people, you're going to do this. And if you're my people, you're going to be blessed. If you don't do it, you're not going to be my people, and you're not going to be blessed. And that's sort of the gist of the entire Old Testament. If you're faithful to God, God will be with you, and great things will happen. If you turn against God, God's not going to be with you, and the things of the world is going to happen, and things are going to fall apart. And this is the idea. This is a very simple idea of how you deal with an orchard and how God's going to be with you. Notice from there to verse 26, you shall not eat any flesh with blood in it. You shall not interpret omens or tell fortunes. You shall not round off the hair of your temples or mar the edges of your beards. You shall not make any cuts on your body for the dead or tattoo yourselves. I am the Lord, I am the Lord. Now, here he goes into talking about you shall not do pagan practices. This is not the first time we've heard this first one, but this has been repeated many times to this point. Don't drink the blood. Don't eat the blood. The blood is supposed to be drained of the flesh. Don't eat that blood. Well, again, the part of that is that the blood is a life force. We hear that from Noah. When Noah comes up to the ark and God gives him meat, that's one of the first things he says. You don't eat the blood with the meat. And the other thing, this was a pagan practice. There was the idea of blood gave you power. Again, I think we talked about this before. We see this even today. Our myth and our idea of monsters, of a vampire. What does a vampire do? Vampire drinks blood. Why? So he can live forever. Because there's life in the blood. There's power in the blood. And that's the idea. You profane the life of whatever you're drinking its blood of. And God says, don't do the blood. Don't drink the blood. Don't eat the blood. But then he goes on from there. He says, you're not supposed to interpret omens or tell fortunes or serve time or observe times. The idea is don't go to these pagan people. This telling omens and interpreting omens or telling fortunes. This is the way the Gentiles would have tried to figure out what the God said. They would cast lots. They would look at bones. They would do all kinds of things. We even see still some of it today. The idea of fortune telling and all that goes with the tarot cards. All those things are trying to ask the dead or some God to give you an answer. And God says, don't do that. You don't go to those gods to get an answer. You come to me. And then he goes on from there to talk about their hair. Don't trim the edges, the hair in your temple or mar the edge of your beard. What this was is this verse and next verse ties together. These were marks that were made by people who were part of certain religious cults. He says, you don't look like the pagans. Don't act like them. You don't cut your beard like they do because they're doing it something for their worship. Verse 28, don't make cuts on your body for the dead. Again, the idea that they would have cuts, and that was part of their worship to their God, was the cut and have the bleeding. We see this in, it left my mind. I believe it's 2 Kings when Elijah is on Mount Carmel. Remember those pagan prophets who are crying out to Baal all day? What do? They cut themselves, saying that Baal will hear us if we cut ourselves. God says, don't do that. And then he goes on from there to talk about this cutting yourselves for the dead. Now, what it means for the dead is trying to get the dead to intercede for you. God's saying, in a roundabout way, what we know, God's saying the dead have no power. They don't have any ability here. And then he goes on to talk about the tattoo. Don't tattoo yourselves. And again, the idea of the tattoo is a ritual tattoo that's tied to those cuts. Tattoo that demonstrates and shows that you're part of this religious cult, you believe in this God, you follow this God. All right, then again, you notice, I'm the Lord your God. Verse 29, do not profane your daughter by making her a prostitute, lest the land fall into prostitution, and the land become full of depravity. You shall keep my Sabbaths and revere my sanctuary. I am the Lord. Again, the idea is the profane your daughter by making her a prostitute is not that a father just wants to have his daughter become a harlot, but because this father starts worshiping a false god. And part of the ways they worshiped their false god was by cult prostitutes. They would have temples of their gods that you would go in, and the way you worship that god was you would have sexual relations with these women and even men in certain temples. And that was the way, and God says, don't do that. Don't act that way, because if you do that, notice, if you prostitute your daughters into serving these other gods, you're prostituting the land. And if you prostitute the land, it means you've turned away from God. You're serving someone other than your true husband, which is what God says throughout the prophets is wrong. To follow a false god is to prostitute yourself to him, to commit adultery against your true husband God. And he says if you do that, the land will be full of depravity, and he'll later say the land will fall. He says, instead of doing those things, he says, keep my Sabbaths. Reverence my sanctuary. Make sure that you're obeying and following my commands and my plan as you're called to do. He goes on from there, verse 31. Do not turn to mediums or necromancers. Do not seek them out and so make yourselves unclean by them. I am the Lord your God. Again, these are another form of people who would try to, the other ones would go to the gods to get their answer. The necromancers and the mediums, or the spiritualists, some translations translate. These are people who would go to the dead, would go to the dead to call the dead forth, to give them an answer. Again, this is not unusual. We see this in the Old Testament. If you remember Saul, when Saul goes in disguise to a foreign land, or to a neighboring land, he finds the witch of Endor. And you remember, he says, call Samuel back. And Samuel comes and says, Saul, what are you doing? You know what you're doing is wrong. And you see that story. It's very interesting because the witch and Saul, everybody's shocked that Samuel actually showed up. And it's because God was teaching him a lesson. But God says, don't do that. Again, the idea is don't go to the dead for an answer. Come to me. Don't be led astray. Keep yourselves clean. And again, notice, you shall make yourselves, or by doing this, you'll become unclean. Verse 32, you shall stand up before the gray head and honor the face of an old man, and you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. When a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as a native among you, and you shall love him as yourself. For you are strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Now, notice what he says here. He gives here a group of people that we are, again, to love, to take care of, who can't take care of themselves. Notice he says first, the gray hair. When the gray hair and the aged, you're to honor them. Remember, he's going to give the commandment to honor your father and mother. Well, here he gives the idea you honor everyone's father and mother. You respect them. Well, what about the gray-haired man? Well, he's wise, he's knowledgeable, but he's also feeble. Or more feeble, I guess I should say, than the younger man. And again, we look throughout the history of the nations. Guess what? Guess what a group of people abused and took advantage of? It was the old. They would prey on the old just like they do today. God says you don't do that. You honor the old man. You look after the older, and you do that, and you'll fear God. Then you notice verse 33, the stranger. When a stranger's in your land, don't take advantage of him. The idea is that if you've got a stranger among you, then the easy thing is for us to do whatever we want to him. He's here with us. He's not one of our people. He doesn't have anybody to protect him, so we can take advantage, do what we want. God says don't do that. Don't be like the nations around you. And it's very interesting that one of the writers I saw pointed this out, because we go back to what we talk about in devotional, love your neighbor as yourself. You know, there's that debate of who is your neighbor. Is it just the Jews or was it everybody? Well, Jesus gives the answer to everybody, but the Jews believed it was just your neighbor or just your fellow Jew. Well, that thought gets blown out of the water with this verse. Because you look at verse 34, God says the one who sojourns among you, treat him as a native, as a common person, and you shall what? Love him as yourself. You love your fellow Jew, and you love the Gentile as yourself. There's no difference. There's no us and them. We're all together. You treat them all the same way. And again, he says, you remember what happened when you come out of Egypt. Remember how Egypt treats you, how they abused you, they enslaved you. Don't get revenge on a sojourner. Instead, treat them like you want to be treated. Treat them as you would want Egypt to have done you. Again, I'm the Lord your God. And then finally, the last 3 verses, and we'll be done. We're going to talk about doing business transactions. You shall do no wrong in judgment, in measures of length or weight or quantity. You shall have just balances, just weights, a just ephah, a just hin. I am the Lord your God, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And you shall observe all my statutes and all my rules and do them. I am the Lord. Now, he starts in verse 35, you shall do no wrong in judgments, in measures of length, weight, or quantity. Here's how this worked. What he's talking about is the way they used to have to buy and sell. You would go to the marketplace to buy and sell your produce or your food. And you would have to go to these merchants, and these merchants would have scales. And these merchants would have a stone, a weight that was denoted to be so much. The idea, put it easy in our idea, of a pound. They would have a weight that was supposed to be a pound. And when the merchant had this balanced scale, they would put the pound weight on one side. And then they would fill the other side up with whatever you were after, flour, say you were buying flour, and you would fill it up until it was balanced. Or if you were selling, you would have to fill up the flour till it was balanced. Well, what happened is that certain businessmen started realizing they could cheat a little bit. They could take that pound, and if they were buying, you had to go by their weight. And if they were buying for you, they can make that pound a little heavier. And when they bought, they were actually buying more than a pound. They were buying over what the technical weight was. And then they began to realize that they can not just do that on the buying side, they can do it on the selling side. They can shave off a little weight. And when you go to buy a pound, what you're actually weighing against is not really a pound. One writer put it this way. It would be about like going to the store and you think you're buying a 2-pound bag of sugar or flour. You get home and you could weigh it yourself and it weighs a pound and a half. Now you paid for a 2-pound bag and that's what the merchant's pound said was 2, but you technically got a half pound. Well, that's because the merchant had cheating scales. He had a cheating weight. And this was the idea that merchants would have weights, one weight for buying and one weight for selling. And they would cheat, or whoever they were doing. And this was a common practice throughout the ancient world. And God says, don't do that. Because here's the other problem. It's not like us. It's not like us. We could go to Walmart and look at their scale, whatever they ring up. We could doubt it. We can come home and we may have our own little kitchen scale that we can cut on and weigh and see. Well, see, the Walmart scale was off. They didn't have that at home. They didn't have a scale to judge and to go by. They were dependent on that merchant. And that's why the merchants could get away with it. They were dependent upon them to do justly. And God says, do justice when you do this. Do not treat each other unfairly, but have just balances, just weights, a just ephah, a just hin. And that idea of an ephah and a hin, that's amounts of grain, amounts of flour they were supposed to have. One of them's about a gallon. And let that be universal. The idea is let your gallon be the same as the next guy's gallon, the next guy's gallon, Israel's supposed to have the same weight, the same measurements the entire way through. And God says, you do this because I am the Lord your God. And I brought you out of Egypt. I brought you out of a land who cheated you, who robbed you, who abused you, who did all these things to you. And I have brought you out of that land and brought you to a safer, better place. And then you notice he ends this chapter, verse 37. You shall observe all my statutes and all my rules and do them. You listen to my law. You want to be my people. You do what I've commanded you to do. Do what I have laid out for you to do. And you do it because I'm the Lord. I am God. These are my rules, my law. And again, we've seen that, again, we sometimes want to look at this and look at these commands, and we think that the old law was just about the obedience and doing it exactly to the T. That's a concept that's later, that the people come up with, the Pharisees come up with. God's plan was the heart. If you had the heart right, you look at all these commands. If you love your neighbor as yourself, guess what? You're going to do a fair weight. If you love your neighbor as yourself, you're not going to misuse or mistreat the stranger. You're not going to if you're loving your neighbor as yourself and you love God as you're supposed to, you're not going to turn to the necromancers, the mediums, do these tattoos, these cuts, do all these various things, because you're going to depend on God. And this is what God lays out. Here's my law. You observe it, be my people, and be blessed, or refuse it. And I'm not your people, or you're not my people. I'm not with you. And you're subject to whatever comes. I'm not going to guarantee I'm going to save you. Now we're going to see the love and mercy of God, and that God's going to let the people turn against him, but he's still going to save them. But God didn't have to save them. When they're his people and they're obedient, God says, I will. I'll do it. But if you're not, it's up to me if I'm going to do it or not. And that's the same as, and again, that same concept is true for us. If we're obedient, we follow God's commands, we're living as God has called us to do, we know the hope, the promise that he has for us. But if we're not, there is no hope, there is no promise, there is no guarantee for us. And just like Israel, we have to choose. Do you obey God, follow God, and have his reward? Or do you disobey him and not have his reward? It's that simple of a choice. We choose which way we want to go. And that was the idea for the law, and that's the idea for us. We either obey God and follow him, or we suffer. Any closing question or comment? You have to go ahead and remind me of that one. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Well, like I say, if you try to obey the law just for the law, like you say, that's the problem of it. And again, I think and the sad reality is, and I'll say this, and we'll be done, is what happened to the old law the law. Well, what happened to the Old Testament, I should say. Yeah, the law of Moses is just what happens to Christianity too. You know, we can very easily get caught up in doing the things rather than the heart. The whole thing of God is the heart. The heart's more important. Mm-hmm. And so that's the thing we've got to learn is what do we do? Do we let God cut our heart and let we obey him, or do we try to do it our way? And that won't get anywhere. All right, appreciate everybody being here and their attention. We're going to stop right there. Next week we'll pick up in Leviticus chapter 20. But for tonight, you're dismissed. Thank you.